Welcome, everyone, to a J Street policy briefing that we're doing here today on the visit of Ahmed al-Shara's White House visit and also on the future of Syria and Lebanon. I'm Elon Goldenberg. I'm J Street's Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer. And this Monday, we will see a truly historic White House meeting after almost 14 years of really devastation in Syria for most of that time. President Assad fell just about nearly a year ago, and now Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, is going to be going into the Oval Office. There's a lot of issues associated with this meeting, a lot of challenges in Syria from the counter-ISIS campaign to Syria's future and stability to uh, sanctions relief, the Syria-Israel relationship and the challenges there. And while we're talking about it, we also want to talk about Syria's neighbor, Lebanon, these two countries so often interlinked and which stands at its own inflection point a year after, just a little bit over a year after the war between Israel and Hezbollah. Trying what we hope to see is progress there with a new government and potentially a new way forward for Lebanon as well. So to have that discussion with us, we have two incredible people I'm really excited to welcome. The first is Ibrahim El-Assil. He is the lead of the Syria Transition Lab at Harvard's Middle East Initiative. He's also spent years at the Atlantic Council, and he was a founding member of the former president of the Syrian Nonviolence Movement and has advised US, European, and regional policymakers. So, Ibrahim, welcome. Um, and the second is Jasmine El-Gamal, who maybe I'll start by saying that Jasmine is a former colleague of mine when I was on the Iran desk at the Pentagon in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. She was on the Syria desk right as the civil war started, right through the Arab Spring. Uh, and she's also, had a lot of other jobs in government, including as a special assistant to three undersecretaries of defense for policy. She's now the CEO of MindWorks Strategy and is also the host of the View from Here podcast. So, Jasmine, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So, so I'm going to start here with a question for both of you, and maybe Ibrahim, I'll go to you first, which is, the first visit by a Syrian president, to the White House, and something just remarkable. We go back a year, in 58 years. Well, I know, let's see. I'll correct myself. The first Syrian
Mm.
president to address the UN in 58 years. I think this might be the first visit by a Syrian president
Ever.
Yeah.
ever to the White
Yeah.
House. Um, could you have imagined this a year ago, or over the last years that we've been working on this issue? When you and I were ran into each other and the Syrian civil war was at its height? And what do you think is the agenda for this meeting?
Yeah, I definitely never imagined this to happen. Elaine, good to be with you and good to see you, Jasmine, likewise. And thanks for J Street for hosting. And absolutely unexpected. I wouldn't have expected the Syrian president to be in the White House with President Trump, and that Syrian president is Ahmed al-Sharaa. So, like, even like multi-level, unexpected events here. Uh, in a way, I'm very glad that things happened that quickly. And when we'll dive deeper, we're gonna go into some nuances for this statement. But generally speaking, I'm glad to see two nations and two countries that I call home, that they are getting closer together, which I think is the natural way for both of them to be. There is a lot of geopolitical and social and economic and cultural values that are actually very much aligned between Syria and the United States. This visit is very important. Many topics will be discussed, mainly two issues: sanctions and security. Sanctions are still there. President Trump ordered them to be lifted. Things are complicated. We're going step by step. And from the security or military perspective, it's about the Defeat ISIS campaign, which will also be discussed about the details and what that means. And we're watching to see how and if Syria, most likely it will join, how it will join, what mandate the American forces in Syria will have, and how that will shape the relationship between both of them.
Yeah, Jasmine, I'd love for you to just start by just chiming in similarly on the overall historic nature of this and your perspective on the meeting.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, it's as you said, I covered the Syria file back in starting 2009. And for the first few years, it was a completely dormant file. I spent most of my time working on Lebanon, actually, because I had both the Syria and Lebanon files, if you remember. And
Mm,
then to witness the beginnings of the Arab Spring and how that impacted Syria, to witness the first foreign fighter spilling into Syria and the devastation that happened over years and years, and working really closely with you, with Syrian colleagues, Syrian opposition, all the way up to last year. I remember I was at the Doha Forum. Ibrahim, I don't remember if I saw you there, if you were there, but I remember
not last
being
year, I
in
wasn't.
Doha
Mhm.
last year, you know, opposition forces were getting closer and closer to Damascus. Everyone was really shocked, and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov was there, and he was doing a live interview on stage literally the day before Assad fell. And the interviewer asked him, you know, we're looking at what's happening. Things seem really kind of,
Mm,
you know, significant. Do you know if Bashar al-Assad is worried? Have you been talking to him? And Lavrov very coolly looks at the audience and says, we are not in the business of asking people how they're feeling. And everyone just kind of, it was that moment where you really felt, you know, what the interviewer was really asking was, are you guys going to step in like you have before, like you did before?
mm,
And Lavrov's answer made it clear that the Russians were going to be taking a hands-off approach. And sure enough, the next day, Damascus fell. And so to go from 2008, 2012, the Arab Spring, to that moment, and just in 1 year, to go from the fall of the Assad regime in Damascus to President Ahmed al-Sharaa being welcomed to the White House. Again, like Ibrahim said, not just as the first Syrian president ever, but this Syrian president. It really just shows you how much has changed, not only in Syria, but in the region as well, and in terms of the US relationship with the region. And I know we'll get into that discussion between on the relationship between the US and Syria and different administrations. But I expect very much, you know, President Trump has made it clear that he has a real affinity for some reason for Ahmed al-Sharaa. He likes him. He says over and over again, I like him. We get along well. He's a tough guy in a tough neighborhood. He feels affinity with him, and so he is more inclined to help him succeed. And the two pillars through which he's providing that help are counterterrorism and security, as Ibrahim mentioned, and economic development, which, as we know, is something President Trump is really interested in throughout the region. So, peace and prosperity being Trump's agenda in general, you really see that being applied to Syria.
So let's start to dive deeper now on the different pieces of this. And Ibrahim, I'll go back to you on the question of just what is happening in Syria and how
mm,
challenging this moment is. Look, Jasmine mentioned the Arab Spring. There's a long history of these changes in regime not necessarily leading to good outcomes. And, Shara himself, right? He also
mm,
has a history, right, of, working for HTS, leading HTS, a relationship with Al-Qaeda. This is where a lot of the initial skepticism came from. I think there's been largely an assessment that he's been quite pragmatic and trying to distance himself from that history. But what are the biggest challenges on the ground right
mm.
now? And do you think he's having some success in at least starting to stabilize the country?
That's a great question, and you know, when we think about the current situation and the domestic situation and the challenges, first, definitely the economic situation comes to mind before we talk about also security and geopolitical and political. But the economic situation in Syria is dire. 90% of Syrians live below poverty line. Most of the infrastructure is destroyed. Neighborhoods are leveled, and towns and villages on the ground. So whatever we're talking about, we need to remember that in the background, because it affects everything that's happening, and it affects also the priorities, the potential, and the likelihood of this government or this authority to succeed or to fail. And on this category, on the economics, one important point is that sanctions are still affecting Syria until today. Big part of them were lifted, but many of them are still there. And then also, even when all sanctions are lifted, economic life usually don't go back to normal immediately. Many businesses and investors will be very cautious in going to Syria until they see that this is something that won't be reversed in the future, and that makes this visit very important, especially that President al-Sharaa most likely he will meet lawmakers, senators, and Congress people to discuss this issue, and I hope that will help move this faster. And the second category of issues internally is also security. And we talk about security in Syria. There are still fragmentation. There are still so many smaller armed groups, many of them integrated within the Ministry of Defense, but that integration is not over yet. It's happening, but it's slow. And add to that, there are also still areas out of the government control. The Northeast, controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, Kurdish-led, American-supported. In the south, Sweda is out of the regime of the government control, with local armed groups also supported, at least politically, by Israel. And there are negotiations happening on both sides. But here also one of the complexity aspects in Syria is also how the domestic issues are related to the bigger geopolitical scene. So when we talk about the Kurds and the negotiations with them, they are not only Damascus Kurds negotiations. Turkey is a major player here, and any outcome Turkey needs to approve, or they could find a way to disrupt it. Similarly, in the south, when it comes to the Druze, Israel is in the background. Israel is an actor, and any agreement with the Druze would affect the relationship with Israel, and also any agreement with Israel would affect the relationship with the Druze. And that brings me to the bigger picture also of the new Syrian social contract and the new political system that's emerging there. How inclusive is it? How sustainable is it? How pluralistic is it? And these questions, generally speaking, I would say first, the jury is still out. I wouldn't jump into conclusions. And I would describe things in a retail approach. There are things that they are good, there are things they are okay, and there are things that they are absolutely bad or not enough. And briefly, there have been negotiations with different centers of power inside Syria, and different people representing different sects and areas and religions and ethnicities inside Syria. But that's still not enough to bring them actually into the room and make them part of this political system. And that's something that President al-Sharaa needs to address soon before things become too late, or I think things will become difficult to do. And I will conclude with also talking about reunifying Syria. Syria today is not unified. For any government in Damascus to be able to convince others, coercion won't work. Uh, Also, just by having better relationship with the region and the world also won't fully help Syria being reintegrated and unified. There is a need for a real national dialogue, not for 1 or 2 or 3 days, but actually for a process that it becomes institutionalized inside Syria. It will take months or probably years for Syrians to talk about so many divisions and challenges they are facing.
Right. So there's a lot there, and I'm going to try to break it down into its like specific pieces, right? Because it sounds like
Okay.
we've got the economic stuff. So I'm going to go to Jasmine first on we have the security question, and then we have the the economic question. I think where the two big ones Ibrahim was talking about. And so on security from an American perspective, I think the real focus is going to be the de-ISIS campaign. That's not the entire thing, as Ibrahim was talking about. There's also this Israel component in the south, but maybe let's start with the de-ISIS campaign, um, and what you see, happening there. And in addition to how the work is going, like what is going to happen in both the conversation between the U.S. There's talk about Syria joining the ISIS coalition in some form. There's also talk of American forces even in Damascus and things like that. Different reports. Um, how is that working, and how do you see it working going forward, Jasmine?
Yeah, well, let's try to, if I can maybe just kind of try to place Syria within the broader regional vision that President Trump seems to have, and again, peace and prosperity agenda that he talks about. This is a president who actually has forged over the years really constructive relationships with a lot of the leaders around the region who are involved in Syria. As Ibrahim mentioned, Turkey is very involved. The Gulf states have a say and have some influence over what's happening and what steps al-Sharaa is taking. And of course, you have Israel on Syria's southern border. And President Trump actually has personal relationships with all of those different leaders and has been using and capitalizing on those relationships in order to move this agenda forward. What he sees, and I just listened recently to Tom Barak, who's the special envoy for Syria and also the ambassador to Turkey, which is also interesting in itself. The fact that those are the two hats that one person wears shows you how closely connected Turkey and the Levant and the region are in President Trump's mind. That in order for Syria, which I think the Trump administration probably rightly sees as being really central to the stability of the entire region. Ilan, you and I were both in government when the Syrian civil war started, when the Arab Spring was happening, and we saw how everything that happened in Syria not just was being influenced by all the other regional actors around Syria, but also uh, had ripple effects outside of the region. Early on in the Arab Spring, at the Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were making the argument for containment. Let's just contain what's happening inside of Syria. And that proved to be a really bad judgment, because what we saw in the ensuing years was that what happens in Syria will affect every part of the region. And so I think partly because of those lessons learned, the focus on Syria is a way also not just for Syria, but also a way to stabilize the entire region, eventually reaching to some kind of arrangement with Israel. There are a lot of cross-border issues between Syria and Lebanon, and we can talk about those later on, and Iranian influence in Syria and how that impacted Lebanon very negatively, and of course Turkey and the SDF and the Kurdish question in the north. So all of these things are really interconnected. And one thing that I've been glad to see in the Trump administration is how they recognize the interconnectedness of all of these issues and are trying to address them concurrently so that it all makes sense holistically. And in order to do that, in order to start this project of stabilization and eventually prosperity for Syria and the region, you need to provide space for Syrians in which to do the work they need to do. And that means security, and that means economic viability. And so that's why, even if you listen to Barbara Leaf speak, who was an ambassador in the Biden administration, she did an interview recently with Al Monitor, with the journalist Amber Zaman, who I recommend people listen to it. She said basically by the time the US started engaging with al-Sharaa after Damascus fell, there was about 6 weeks left in the Biden administration before they would hand over to the Trump administration. And Barbara Leaf was saying a lot of things that you hear the Trump administration saying now about the importance of lifting sanctions. You know, when she got some pushback from the journalist doing the interview about whether the sanctions should be lifted based on progress on certain issues or behavioral changes, she said, no, I would have advised President Biden, had we had more time in the administration, I would have advised him to remove the Caesar sanctions, to remove all of these impediments to Syrian prosperity and to Syrian advancement in what they were trying to do. And it's exactly like Ibrahim said. We've had these 6-month waivers, right? But investors don't want to come into Syria not knowing what's going to happen after 6 months. They need to know that they're coming in and they're able to invest with some longer time frame. And it's important to remember also that sanctions relief can always be reversed, right? So the idea here was, let's open it up. Let's give Syrians a chance. And we can always put the sanctions back on if we need to, right? But let's just give them a chance now. Let's start to create that breathing room. And the same principle applies to security. Now, Syria is expected to join the Defeat ISIS coalition formally when Ahmed al-Sharaa goes to Washington. That's one of the biggest issues on the agenda, and it'll be a very tangible takeaway of, you know, the extent of the cooperation between the US and Syria. There are about 88 nations in the coalition currently, so Syria would join those. It's important also to remember that counterterrorism cooperation has already been ongoing between the US and the al-Sharaa administration, the transitional government. There have been about 75 counter-ISIS operations already done by the Syrian government, many with US intelligence support. There have been joint operations between US Central Command and the Syrian government. And even before Ahmed al-Sharaa became president, when he was fighting ISIS himself in Idlib, he was already going and doing that work to defeat ISIS and to counter ISIS. So this really is a very natural progression, not just of the US-Syria relationship, but also personally for Ahmed al-Sharaa and what he's been doing vis-a-vis ISIS. It's a continuation of that, and bringing Syria into the fold in that way, I think, and I'll stop here, I think is a really solid building block, not just because ISIS is a genuine continuing threat in Syria, and we've mentioned briefly the ISIS camps in the north that have to be dealt with somehow. But because it offers a framework for Syria to begin cooperating with other countries in a way that could set the scene and set the tone for cooperation eventually with bordering countries on cross-border issues, whether that's Israel or Lebanon or Turkey.
So, Ibrahim, back to you. And I kind of wanted to ask you a quick question and maybe a longer question because we just haven't gotten quite into the depth.
Mm.
On the one thing on the sanctions, you mentioned that one of the key parts of this visit is to try to get members of Congress to also lift some of these sanctions because they have a major role to play there. You think there's possibility of success there, or where are we precisely in this process of trying to get these sanctions lifted?
There is a good chance for success, but time is of the essence, and sanctions are so much within different legislations and parts of the governments that many people haven't been able to tell how exactly will these sanctions will be fully removed. Like, when do we say at some point that yes, all sanctions are gone, nothing still on Syria as an obstacle for its growth and rehabilitation. But to talk to members of Congress is very, very important, and especially around this time of the year, because if they don't take a big decision, it might take much longer, and we might have to wait for another cycle. So I hope this visit is not too late to go and meet with them and talk about this before the end of the year, because I think the NDA and I'm not sure, and correct me, Ilan or Jasmine, if this is wrong. I think these are the days this week when they vote on it, and if repealing Caesar is not part of it, it's gonna be much more difficult to do that in the future. So that's for the economic part, and also it's very important to hear from President al-Sharaa his vision economically, but also for Syria, for economic reasons, for American businesses to start to consider Syria seriously. Many of them, they've been very curious about Syria. They wanted to know what's happening. They wanted to send people. Many companies wanted to sign MAUs with the Syrian government. But when it comes to real money and real investments, everyone is still extremely hesitant and cautious about that. And that's something President Trump could address. So I also hope we see some meetings with probably some big investors to talk about these things and to talk about the rule of law and if the Syrian judiciary is functioning again or not, something that investors are very interested in to make sure that their investments are secure. So this is for the sanctions part. Did you have another part
Yeah,
in
so
your
that was it.
question?
Yeah, that was the first question I was gonna ask you, and then the question for both of you, and it's also started to come up in the chat, and it's kind of a natural for J Street. So I'll go Ibrahim to you first, and then Jasmine. The challenges in the south, right, and particularly the
Mm,
challenges in Israel and Syria. A lot of talk about some kind of a deal. Personally, I find the notion of Syria joining the Abraham Accords right now to be that seems like a step or two too far, but some kind of a deal. Maybe, I mean, but that seems not that realistic, but some kind of a deal that the Trump administration is trying to broker to at least reduce tensions, go away from hostilities, things like that. Where do we think things stand on that? Ibrahim, I'll
Jasmine, would
start
you
with
like me
you,
to
and
go
then I'll go
first?
to
Yeah,
Jasmine.
Yeah, why don't you go,
sure.
Ibrahim?
So when we talk about the South, there are two major issues or two buckets of points to talk about, and they are linked, but they are also separate. We're talking about Israel, and we're talking about the Druze inside Syria. So at first, I'll talk about Israel geopolitically before we talk about, but later on the role maybe with that with the Druze. But with Israel and Syria, I mean, technically they've been at war, but there was a ceasefire. There was the 1974 disengagement agreement that created a buffer zone between them, and Israel kept the Golan Heights, which for Syrians and for the international community is a Syrian occupied land by Israel. The US administration in the first term, Trump recognized that to be part of Israel, and there was like it was very calm on between the Syrian Israeli borders. With the collapse of the regime, the Assad regime on December 8th, and to borrow the explanation of President Ahmed al-Sharaa in the 60 Minutes interview, he said, it seems like Israel then understood the agreement collapsed as well. From the new authority perspective, the agreement holds. For them, they didn't violate the 1974 agreement at all. There was a huge aerial bombardment campaign by Israel in December, around 500 attacks against everything that was left of the Syrian army and its capabilities and arms depot and fighter jets, etc. And then there were around another 500 attacks between then and today against different targets. There were zero attacks from Syria, and this is important to highlight. There were no attacks. Not initial ones, not later on. At some point, some smaller groups tried to attack, and the Syrian government went after them. I think there is a huge gap between the communications and the understanding between both sides, and that's natural. I also think there is a huge opportunity to change the nature of the relationship between Syria and Israel. But before we talk about that, and Ilan, as you say, that when you talk about at the Abraham Accords, the Abraham Accords so far they've been for countries that were not at war per se with Israel, and they have no territorial disputes with Israel. The Syrian case is very, very different. However, I think first we need a security agreement to go back to military de-escalation and calmness, and then there will be more negotiations for how that work in the future. I do think there is a huge potential, but also we cannot talk about this without linking it to the bigger picture also, that where the Israeli-Palestinian relationships go, the Israeli-Saudi relationships go, all of that will deeply also affect what could happen with the Syrians, what would be sustainable with the Syrians, and also how the reaction in the future within Syria and Israel and across the region would be.
Yeah, no, and it makes sense. And look, I agree. I think from the Israeli side, the definitely, I think the mentality was we don't know what's happening on the other side, so we're gonna go in first and ask questions later, especially in the like just a year after, October 7th, and the mentality of
Right.
this particular government. But I agree the importance of trying to de-escalate first and trying to get to that step. Jasmine, to you, I want to just also get your take on what you think needs to happen in the South, and specifically the role the U.S. can play, as a former U.S. policymaker and as part of this trip, if this could be part of the agenda. And then I'll just throw in another one just because it's been in the Q&A, which is where the Russians stand at this point. You started talking about Lavrov and where he was a year ago, but the Russian role or lack thereof in Syria today.
Sure. I think in terms of the Syria-Israel relationship, what's happening in the South, the prospect of normalization, we have a couple of things going for Syria and for the region really. Is there is a lowest common denominator here when we talk about Syrian interests and we talk about Israeli interests, which is it is in neither party's interests to enter into a conflict with one another under this new regime in Syria, in this new government in Syria. And to his credit, Ahmed al-Sharaa understands that and has been really clear in stating that he sees himself as being a leader of a different kind of Syria, a Syria that is at peace with its neighbors, a Syria that is focused on Syrians and their needs, economic needs, security needs, and that he's not going to be, an Arab leader who's, sort of railing against Israel and using that to rally people around him and around the flag. We haven't really seen that. I think Israel went in really strong after the fall of Assad because they were, one can't blame them in a certain sense. I mean, they were quite worried about what this guy would do and who he was and look at his background. And so we're going to get in there and we're going to be proactive. While I understand why they did that, I also think that did quite a bit of damage in terms of Israeli intentions and in terms of the image of Israel within Syria as well. Look, they're not even giving us a chance. Look, they're going in. Look, they're encroaching. Look, they're trying to get more territory from day one before we've even had a chance to breathe and process everything. So I think that did a bit of damage there. But the US has really been involved in those talks and those conversations between the Israelis and the Syrians and playing what I would describe as a constructive role. Tom Barak was speaking about this. Again, he was talking about how the Syria and Israel have held 5 rounds of talks now so far, aimed at updating the 1974 armistice agreement, and that the Americans would like to see a security deal potentially by the end of the year, something that Trump could claim as yet another victory in the region in his first year as president for the second time, but also, as I was saying before, something to build on. And I think all of these different deals and negotiations that you're seeing the Trump administration involved in across the region are really, like I said, meant to reflect the interconnectedness of all these issues and build upon one another in order to secure a better foundation on which to build actual regional peace. Now, I will say that this particular Israeli government has not always been on the same page about the need to work through negotiations versus military means. We've seen that both in Syria and Lebanon, and that has hindered, I think, some progress. I think more progress could have been made had we had a different Israeli government in place right now. But that said, I think the Americans are doing what they can to try to push this issue forward. I'll just say one last thing about normalization because I agree with you that normalization does seem like a step too far. And I think that as long as the Saudis are still kind of, stepping away from the idea of normalization, it gives cover to the Syrians for saying, well, the Saudis haven't normalized, we're not going to normalize. As Ibrahim really astutely said, none of the countries in the Abraham Accords have been at war with Israel. This is a completely different situation. But I was just speaking to an Emirati policy analyst the other day, and we were talking about the Abraham Accords and the potential expansion. And he said there's a reason why Netanyahu has not come to the UAE or been invited and to sit with MBZ, the ruler of the UAE. And that is because the way that Netanyahu has presented the Abraham Accords, and especially and particularly in this case with the UAE, is that they basically got it for free, that they didn't really have to do much as Israel to get that deal with the UAE. Other countries are watching that in the region, and other countries are trying to position themselves as much as they can that if they are going to do this, most likely for Trump to appease him, no matter what the timeline is, they will want to make sure that they are also getting something out of it and that the normalization benefits them and is not just one more thing that Benjamin Netanyahu can claim credit for without having to make any concessions on his side.
Yeah, well, and that's why at J Street we consistently, well, two things to just add to that. One is why we consistently talk about what we call the 23 state solution, which is the only way this is going to work ultimately is peace between Israel and all of its Arab neighbors. And as part of that, you know, a new Palestinian state, the 23rd state being a piece of this too. And I think especially in the aftermath of Gaza and conversations I was having when I was in government, it's I think before the war, it was plausible that you would have a whole bunch of countries normalize with Israel for something symbolic and small for the Palestinians, and that would be it. And the Palestinians were kind of seen as a sideshow, and we need to
Yeah.
move on. That's not the case anymore. And you see it now with efforts at the UN Security Council and the UN on the resolution on Gaza. I've seen some of the versions that have been coming out of that, the efforts on an international security force, on some kind of a transitional governance structure. A lot of work going into real progress on this, and hard to imagine without a cooperative Israeli government working with the Arab states to move all this forward beyond where we are right now in Gaza, not end up in this permanent ceasefire that we're going to see, what you call normalization, right?
Yeah.
Now, a healthy security deal to de-escalate the situation between Israel and Syria, I think, is in everybody's interest, and that's very different. And that would be, I think, a very positive first step and doesn't need to be linked to progress with the Palestinians, right? That's just in Israel's interest and certainly in
Yeah.
Syria's interest.
Mhm.
But anyway, we should pivot on to Lebanon. And chat for a few minutes. In the meantime, if people want to be throwing questions into the Q&A, please do so. But let's talk about Lebanon for a few minutes here. Ibrahim, we're about a little bit over a year now from the war between Israel and Hezbollah that I think, frankly, had significantly more setbacks for Hezbollah than I think folks had anticipated. I think than the Israelis had anticipated at the time, than the U.S. had anticipated at the time, and actually brought in the aftermath a more maybe a more capable government and a more moderate government that kind of wants to at least further distance from Hezbollah and assert more power in Lebanon. How is that all going at this point?
I think the best way to try to look at Lebanon after we talk about Syria is probably to do a little bit of comparison between them, because you have the current president Joseph Aoun and the current prime minister Nawaf Salam. They came to power around the same time that al-Sharaa did. But one of the major differences between them is how much control they have over the military and security in their own countries. And for Ahmed al-Sharaa, he has been able to deliver more because he actually came on the wave of an armed group. Uh, for On and Salam, things have been more complicated on the Lebanese side structurally, because last year there was a huge change in Syria. There wasn't a huge change similarly in Lebanon, besides, of course, as you say, decimating the leadership of Hezbollah, which is something huge for Lebanon and the region, and we're still seeing the aftermath of that. But they are still the issue of Hezbollah's weapons and arms is still a real challenge, and still not clear if the Lebanese armed forces and the Lebanese government will be able to disarm Hezbollah. How would that happen? Will be there at some point a point of explosion between them and eruption of violence or not? All of these are important things to watch. And add to that also the Syrian-Lebanese relationships. There is also huge opportunity for both of them, because for a long time the relationship was always, to put it mildly, toxic between Lebanon and Syria. You either have governments in Syria and presidents, especially I'm talking about the Ba'ath regime and Assad, who didn't respect Lebanon's sovereignty and independence and always intervened. And then there was the occupation of Lebanon for 15 years. And then you have the Lebanese intervention in Syria. The Hezbollah is a Lebanese actor, and from that perspective, Lebanon was an actor in the war inside Syria. But 3 points: borders, prisoners, and smuggling are major points of tension still between them, especially that the Syrian Lebanese borders, many of them, Hezbollah has lots of leverage. And from the Syrian side, they've been trying to push against that. There are Syrian prisoners in prison of Rumia, and that there have been lots of negotiations about them for the Syrian government to get them. And then weapons smuggling from Lebanon to the Syrian coast, to remnants of the Syrian regime. That's also been a major point of discussions between both sides. Uh, and finally, again, I think there's a huge opportunity, but the challenges are real because of the domestic situation, and again, also because of the legacy of the relationship between Syria and Lebanon.
Jasmine, interested in your take on Syria, on Lebanon, and the state of Hezbollah right now.
Yeah. I mean, so again, as you and I both mentioned, I covered Lebanon when I was at DoD starting in 2008 all the way up till when I left.
Actually,
So
forgot about that. Was also part of the operation. Yes, of course.
that's right. I mean, you and I actually would have a lot of conversations about it too. And one of so I want to bring in some of those conversations without saying anything I'm not supposed to say, but because a lot of the issues and a lot of the challenges that we face now with the issue of Hezbollah's disarmament have been there from when you and I were working at the Pentagon and trying to deal with these issues or to address them. So the US Lebanon policy right now, I am actually quite critical of the Trump administration's approach towards Lebanon, whereas I'm actually very supportive of their approach towards Syria. I think they're much more in tune with what is needed in Syria and how far to go and how fast to go and what the impediments are than they seem to be in Lebanon. When you listen to Tom Barak speak about Lebanon, he is getting increasingly frustrated, visibly frustrated. He has really upset and angered and frustrated a lot of Lebanese because of the way he talks about Lebanon. Comes off as really condescending, really derogatory. He makes a lot of statements like, oh, the Lebanese, they know how to talk, but they don't know how to do anything. Or, Lebanon is a failed state. Or I'm giving you one last chance and then I'm never coming back here again. You're left to your own devices. I mean, it's a very, very condescending tone, which I find is not helpful because, as Ibrahim said, and as you know, the issue of Hezbollah's disarmament is such a fraught and complicated one. you are dealing with an organization that, although I will say that after the Israeli attack on Hezbollah and the beeper operation and however you might want to describe it, I don't ascribe to the view that it was as targeted and free of collateral damage as some people. But Hezbollah has been very weakened, very degraded. Its leadership has been decimated. It is not the same organization it was a year ago. But that said, the Lebanese armed forces and the Lebanese state are still very weak. And part of the reason why the Lebanese armed forces is weak, and this is a critical aspect of the discussion that I think the Americans don't pay as or give enough respect to, I think, is that a large part of why the Lebanese armed forces are so weak and cannot do things like procure equipment or, planes or advanced equipment is because the Israelis don't allow it, is because Israel has essentially veto power over what the US does to provide assistance and support and training and material support to the Lebanese armed forces. And I remember being in government and working. I would go to Lebanon. I would sit in sessions with the Lebanese armed forces. I would, listen to them talk about their strategy and what they need to get there. And they were always really limited by the fact that the US just wasn't going to give them what they needed in order to tell the Lebanese people, look, we don't need Hezbollah. We have a state, we have an army. We have an army that can defend you, that can protect our borders. But anytime the LAF would talk about protecting borders, the Israelis would see that as a potential threat to them. And they would also raise doubts about just how much Hezbollah was a part of the Lebanese armed forces, both as individuals. And so all of these issues are really complicated to sort of try to unpack. How do you build up a military and a state so that it can replace this powerful non-state actor when you actually can't provide it the support that it needs in order to build itself up? The other thing that the Lebanese will always say, when you talk to them, and rightly so, you're pushing us to essentially confront Hezbollah faster you know, and more aggressively than we're ready to do right now. If this turns into a civil war, are you, the US, going to come in and protect us when we're fighting against Hezbollah and people are being slaughtered in the streets? So you're pushing us to do this, but where are you going to be when the inevitable happens? No Lebanese wants to return to civil war. And that's obviously not good for the region either, right? You have, again, the spillover effects that we were talking about earlier. So the idea of Hezbollah's disarmament, while it is important, and of course the arms should eventually be gathered under one state umbrella, the process has been rushed. And the Lebanese state, I think, would say that we do not feel as supported in what we need. The last element of that, I'll say, which reminds me also a bit of, Hamas versus the Palestinian Authority. If you're trying to weaken one party, so let's say Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have to be willing to bolster the other party and allow it to have some wins that it can display to its people. But as long as the Lebanese armed forces and the Lebanese state continue to be undermined by the Netanyahu government, it'll be that much harder for them to take the necessary difficult steps that they might need to take towards that issue of Hezbollah's disarmament.
Yeah, and no, I was going to actually draw that parallel because what you're describing with Hezbollah is very similar to what's happening with Hamas and the PA and maybe even on steroids right now as we're looking at like what this future of Gaza looks like. There's no disarming Hamas without first empowering an alternative and having that alternative like go in and really assert itself, not by having to shoot the place up, but by actually just demonstrating basic counterinsurgency 101. You got to demonstrate that you're actually the one in charge of security and over time become that security provider for the population. Then you can get the disarmament. It's about replacement. And if there's the same mentality, in Gaza that there has been in Lebanon, It's just not gonna, it's not gonna work.
But also, Ilan, I think equally, you have to remove the reason that allows these non-state actors to claim that they need those weapons, right? So there's no doubt that, Israelis are absolutely, when they say we have rockets being fired into the north, we have to do something. Well, of course they have to do something. No country would allow itself to just have, be open to rockets being rained into their territory. But there's a difference between going in unilaterally with these strikes and into Lebanese territory unilaterally, undermining the Lebanese government in the process, and working with the Lebanese government and the Lebanese armed forces in order to secure that border, which would be a win-win for Israel and for Lebanon. So that's also an important aspect of it, is you have to take away the reason.
Yeah. No, and that's also true on the Palestinian side if you're going to work with the Palestinian
Absolutely. Of
Authority,
course.
and whatever alternative is. All right, we have just a few minutes left, and there's a couple of questions that have come up consistently in the Q&A. So the two questions I think folks would like us to dive deeper on are the Druze inside of Syria and the border with Israel and the dynamics there. We kind of got in, Ibrahim started to get into it a little bit before, but we didn't really we dove much more into the Israel-Syria dynamic than into the Druze. And the other, Russia and Syria. So I'm going to kind of just toss it out there and maybe Ibrahim, maybe you could do the Druze, and then Jasmine, you can do the Russians, and you can both comment on both if you'd like to.
Sure. So for the Druze in South Syria today, and for the violence, how I was looking at the questions, some of them about how it happened. How it happened initially, we don't know. The things we know that definitely there were so many crimes and violations committed against the Druze, including from government forces, which the government also acknowledged, but also there were violations committed by Druze fighters against other components in Sueda. And I think what exacerbated the issue is that the leadership of the Druze Hikmet al-Hijri has been having a maximalist approach with zero potential for reconciliation. He's seeking full independence, which I think is really, really not viable through any way you could think about it. And I think that's actually complicating the issue further. So for the types of the questions about, okay, here we are today, the division is deep. What could happen? I think domestically, first there should be a more serious reconciliation approach from Damascus by showing how they will hold those accountable that actually killed and looted and humiliated Druze in the south. B, there should also be an acknowledgement that the Sueda, like many other parts of Syria, will have some sort of decentralization, and they will be allowed to run their security on the local level. C, there is also a need from the Druze leadership to also recognize that they will be part of Syria, and they need a bigger reconciliation, and they should. And this is an opportunity to shape the whole political system in Syria rather than to just shape it in Sueda. Because with continuation of the current trajectory, it's only the talks about what will happen in Sueda, but I think this should also be about the rest of Syria. And here, the Israeli angle, because also I understand the Druze sensitivity among the Israeli Druze and the rest of the Israeli society. However, this could really be switched to become an opportunity and a bridge between the two countries. They both have Druze population in Syria and in Israel. And this actually, after the security agreement, it could be a way to start opening people to people channels and to move, because also one of the questions was about if Israel wants Syria fragmented or not. I think at some point that was the perception. I hope that changed a little bit recently. And I truly believe for the long term, fragmented Syria is the largest risk that Israel wants to have on its borders. So this is in 2 minutes. Something is very complicated. There are lots of nuances. I know I butchered on the way, but at least I tried to draw the big picture. And Jasmine, I will let you talk about that and Russia as well, if you like.
No, you were, I mean, your insights are always excellent, Ibrahim, and thank you. I really don't have much to add on what you just said about the Druze. I will, if Ilan will allow me a 30-second self-promotion of the podcast, The View from Here, that I host. We did
Mm,
actually a deep dive into the issue of Suwaida and the Druze and the rise of Ahmed al-Sharaa, where he was, who he is now. If people
mm,
are more interested in diving deeper, it was a really good conversation. So please do check that out. In terms of Russia, I guess I would just say, and I also would like Ibrahim's thoughts on this. Um, like any other actor, but you know, regional actor, we talked about how regional actors have all historically and to this day have had a desire to maintain some sort of influence in Syria to shape the future of Syria, because again, whatever happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria.
mm, mm,
Russia particularly has a history, right? I mean, Russian support for Bashar al-Assad was absolutely instrumental in maintaining his regime. Russia supported the most horrific and heinous war crimes against the Syrian people for years. You know, everything that they're doing in Ukraine now, we saw them do and support before in Syria. And so what you see them trying to do right now is kind of fairly awkwardly try to just pretend that that stuff never happened and just try to
mhm,
turn a new page, as if you will, with Syria. So you've seen Ahmed al-Sharaa go to Russia. He's met with Putin. Russia voted in the UN Security Council resolution that the US put forward on removing Ahmed al-Sharaa's name from the list of designated terrorists of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, making a big show in their remarks and their intervention after the vote that, you know, we have to support them and this is a new day, new government, you know. So of course the Syrians are going to try to maintain some of their influence in Syria that they had under Bashar al-Assad. They have a naval base, they have an air base. They're going to try to maintain a foothold through those military installations. I would be interested in Ibrahim's thoughts on how you think Ahmed al-Sharaa is going to kind of strike that balance between making nice with the Russians, because again, it's not in his interest to have
mm,
enmity with the Russians, but making it clear also, which I think he has tried to do, if you see it in his statements and actions, that this is a sovereign government. This is a sovereign Syrian government, and it is going to make decisions based on the interest of Syria and Syrians. But again, I'd be interested in Ibrahim's interpretation of what that might actually look like moving forward.
Okay. I was about to end us at 1 o'clock, but Ibrahim, you can take the
Oh,
last
sorry.
shot for
and
Jasmine. Like,
I will
well,
do
it's
it and just maybe a couple of comments on Russia because for the I think also from the Israeli perspective they would probably want to see a Russian role because they don't want Turkey to fill the gap the vacuum that might be left. And also another point on what Jasmine excellently explained, there was an agreement between Ahmed al-Shara and the Russians during the battle to topple the regime the last few days. We still don't know a lot of the details about it. We know that he promised them to maintain their strategic interests there, which also makes sense for him to diversify and to hedge and to balance different powers against each other. But we're yet to know actually what that entails. I think with the visit to the US, and what type of agreements there will be also with the US, that would probably also help us understand that what type of relationship will be with the Russians as well. And Jasmine, also, I just signed up for your podcast. Another
Oh,
promotion for the podcast.
thank you.
Of course.
all right. Well, with that, everybody can sign up for Jasmine's podcast. Review the name again.
The View from
The
Here.
view from here.
It's on
Also, well,
Apple, Spotify, on YouTube. Thank you for allowing me to make a little plug for it.
I'll also plug Word on the Street, which is our weekly on Substack that Jeremy Benami and I do on all things that we're dealing with in J Street. And
Okay.
with that, Ibrahim, you can add that to your list too.
I did. I actually just did.
It's great. I love the conversations
Yeah.
between you and Jeremy.
um,
They're great.
And so, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you especially to Jasmine and Ibrahim, a very valuable and insightful conversation on what we can expect and where things are going. And with that, I'll wish everybody, a nice Friday evening, good weekend, Shabbat Shalom, for Jasmine, it's you're in London, so now you can definitely get going with your Friday evening. Thank you for doing this hour. And
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
all right. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you both.
Goodbye. Take care.
Thank you.